rule of law and social norms. So when you travel around, you'll notice that some places have really strong laws and harsh laws, and other places have very loose laws that are very lenient. And in general, it is the case that places that have harsher laws actually have weaker social norms. So when we're talking about the distinction between laws and norms, right, we're talking about what are the rules on paper, what are the consequences for breaking the law in a given place. And when we're talking about social norms, we're talking about behaviors. We're talking about what is it that the normal, everyday people are doing on a day-to-day basis. What's culturally acceptable, and to what degree do people actually follow those laws. So the rule of law is the extent to which the law as it's set out is actually followed in practice. And this includes both people obeying the law as well as general enforcement of the law. And what you'll find is that, ironically enough, the places where the laws are the harshest are usually the places where the social norms are the weakest with respect to what the law says, right? So when we're talking about law, there's, the spirit of the law, there's the letter of the law. The spirit is sort of the animating force or the intention, or the desire, the cultural understanding that inspires the law. And then of course there's the actual letter of the law, what it literally says. And judges and other principals and magistrates are always in charge of interpreting these things. But generally speaking, you have this weird tendency where social norms are very weak, or they're not in accordance with the rule of the law, then the laws tend to be stronger. And so you can actually view law as compensating for a lack of social norms. When we talk about freedom, when we talk about free people, what we really mean, historically, are people that are capable of self-governance, right? Of self-ordering, of managing their own affairs and resolving internal conflicts amongst themselves without too much destruction. And so in order to have a free people, you actually need to have very strong social norms. And now, sometimes people get this the other way around. There are cases where, a country will have weak norms around something, and then the laws will come in, and the laws will be strict in order to enforce the rule of law or some order that the people are not otherwise doing in their norms. And occasionally, that does actually translate directly into the adaptation of norms. That is, the social norms catch up to the law as it's intended. One case where I think this is pretty obvious is a place like Bukele's El Salvador, where he's come into power, he's instituted some new laws, he keeps adding on more strict laws, laws against having tattoos, laws against gang affiliation, laws against littering in public, urinating in public, things like that. And you see that, when those laws are enforced and enforced widely, then the social norms actually change. Now, part of this is because you just remove all of the criminals from your society, and so the people that are most inclined to not follow the law are no longer roaming around breaking it. So there is this complex relationship between norms and laws. Sometimes norms will lead to laws, and I think in general that's the more naturalistic tendency. That is, when we talk about something like natural law, we're usually talking about the sort of bottom-up development of a jurisprudence out of a set of cultural norms and understandings. But there can also be the other direction where the laws end up informing and shaping the social norms. The interesting thing about this is that if you have groups of people, or a group of people, who are not inclined to follow the law because it doesn't culturally jive with them, it's not in line with their own values, then you have a bit of a problem, because basically you can overcome these kinds of discrepancies between the norms and the laws. But in order to do that, again, there needs to be a lot of enforcement, and also a lot of education, which usually functions as a kind of propagandistic element. One good example of this is that a lot of the places that that I've been in lately, like Indonesia, for example, was colonized many times, and one of the reasons why they are more developed than some other places in the region is because the Dutch tied their independence to the institution of certain laws that they knew would lead to an increase in social norms, things like widespread public education. And Thailand actually had a similar arc, where even though Thailand was never actually colonized, part of the deal for the British not invading Thailand was that they had to sort of reform themselves and become a more modernized country. And so there can be pressure internally, there can be pressure top down, there can be pressure bottom up, and there can be pressure externally for the institutions of laws and social norms. But I would actually say that even though laws can end up shaping social norms and reshaping a country as they are intended to, again with proper enforcement, that generally speaking, social norms are stronger. And the reason why social norms are stronger is because of transaction costs. Now you can think of transaction costs. Transaction costs is a term from microeconomics, and it refers to the cost or the price that you pay in order to facilitate a transaction. Now this transaction could be any number of things. It doesn't have to be purely monetary. You could say that a transaction is the ability to to park in an area, or rather the refraining from parking in an area where there's a no parking sign, right? So if you're in a country where people listen to the no parking sign, then there's not going to be people parking there. And you don't need to enforce it because people just go ahead and they see the sign and they don't park there. However, if you're in a country that has weak social norms around, following the rules on the sign, and there's a no parking sign, well, maybe they just ignore it. And maybe they habitually ignore it and it doesn't get enforced. And then it just becomes the norm that this sign basically doesn't even matter. And so one of the interesting things about having good cultural norms is that they end up reducing enforcement costs. So we can think of enforcement costs as equivalent to transaction costs. That is, if you make a law but then you don't enforce it, then the law is kind of redundant. In fact, it actually undermines authority even more because of the fact that it's seen that the authority is basically impotent. Now that can happen in different localized regions, or it can happen on a broader scale. But basically, you don't want to be making laws that you cannot or will not enforce, or will not be enforced. And so, one of the things you have to think about whenever you're creating laws is, what are the enforcement costs? Are there going to be costs associated with keeping this up? And will those costs continue? Will they grow over time, or will they shrink over time? Right? So if you designate an area a no parking zone, are the norms such that you're living in a place where people will just see the sign and not park there? Or are the norms such that people will see the sign and just completely ignore it and do whatever they want? If it's the latter, then maybe you end up having to hire a parking guard, right? And now you're paying for that guy to go around and give tickets or impound cars or something like that. And so now the cost of having that enforcement has gone dramatically up. And so you've made a law that's also come along with a special cost that you have to pay. However, if you can figure out norms, if you can crack people's self-understanding of what is culturally allowed and what is not, then you don't have to do enforcement, because people will just follow the law. And as a pragmatic issue, there cannot be enforcement in all places at all times for every case, right? When you think of things like the modern surveillance state, whether you're talking about like the NSA gobbling up massive amounts of data, or if you're talking about something much more personal, like for example the level of surveillance that a state like China aims for with its own citizenry, and other sort of totalitarian states have historically tried to enforce, then what you're talking about is an attempt by the state to enforce the law everywhere and at all times in all situations, and their willingness to go about doing that in this very top-heavy way, rather than establishing simply the norm. Now again, you can re-normalize norms, you can get people to adjust their expectations, adjust their behavior. Oftentimes, a little bit of enforcement right at the beginning, so people are going to resist, and then you show that the law is going to be enforced. You do a sort of demonstration of force, and then the norm changes. And then if you do that over several iterations, along with, again, broad education, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, then you can actually get, a renormalization. You can get that norm established as a norm, and then your enforcement costs go down. So whenever you're thinking about laws, you should always be thinking about norms and the enforceability of those laws and whether or not those laws match up with culture that you're instituting them in. And if they don't, how you can change the culture in order to fit those laws. Thank you for watching.